Welcome to the Cursed Hour, where every whisper in the dark, every creak in the floor, might be something watching threes. If you found this channel, you're already part of the curse. The delivery that went wrong. The city's pulse was faint at dusk, its streets emptying as a young courier idled in a 7-Eleven parking lot, a rare trading card worth a fortune in his pocket. He waited, the engine humming, unaware that the night was about to turn deadly. Most deliveries were simple: hand over the goods, take the cash, drive away. But this one felt off, the buyer's secrecy and the empty lot stirring unease. The card was a prize, and prizes drew predators, their eyes glinting in the shadows. A figure moved nearby, erratic, unpredictable, practicing strange movements by a dumpster. The courier watched, his gut tightening, sensing trouble, but not yet seeing the blade hidden in the dark, waiting for its moment. The buyer arrived, hooded and cautious, his excitement over the card almost childlike. But his careless taunt sparked a fire, and the night erupted, a machete gleaming under streetlights, its wielder charging with murderous intent. Instinct took over, the courier's car roaring to life, headlights pinning the attacker. A split-second decision, a collision, and the night froze. Had he saved a life or ended one? The answer lay in the blood on the pavement. Without boring you with all the minor details, I ended up in some unfortunate employment circumstances back when I was in my 20s, and I turned to Craigslist to solve my money problems. The city was unforgiving, rent due and savings gone, so I posted ads for anything legal, odd jobs, errands, whatever paid. I know a lot of you might be thinking, well, no wonder you ended up with a scary story. But honestly, it was a pretty sweet gig for a while. The hustle was chaotic but freeing, each job a small victory against the grind. I posted just about everywhere advertising, just about any kind of service that kept me fully clothed and out of jail. And to my surprise, the thing that really took off was the courier service I offered. People needed things moved fast, documents, packages, niche collectibles, and I had a car and time. I got a call from a guy who sold what I lovingly call nerd stuff. His name was Vince, a wiry guy with a basement full of treasures, rare video games, trading cards, vintage consoles, all imported or scavenged for collectors across the tri-state area. He made a lot of money doing it, but he didn't have the time or the employees to get all his deliveries done without a little help. And that is how he ended up becoming a regular customer of mine. Vince called weekly, his orders steady enough to keep my lights on. I supplemented my between jobs income with other stuff, but my nerd guy would call at least once or twice a week. By month 2, I was his unofficial driver, crisscrossing the city with packages that smelled of old plastic and ambition. He even used to tip me sometimes when he made a big sale. A crisp 20 here, a 50 there. Small gestures that made the long drives worth it. And for the most part, all the deliveries he sent me on went nice and smoothly. Except this one delivery, which almost went spectacularly wrong. The job started like any other. Vince handed me a sealed envelope, the card inside a thin sheet of plastic, its value a whisper in my ear, nearly $1,000. So, every now and then, my nerd guy would trust me with the delivery of something big, and said half the reason he tipped me is because I did my job and delivered the card, or game or whatever, instead of just stealing it. Honesty was my currency, and Vince valued it, his trust growing with each successful drop. He was paying me about $20 for our local deliveries, more for ones that were further out. But the cards that I was delivering were worth hundreds of dollars to the right people. I didn't have any inclination to rob this poor guy. I just wanted an honest pay for honest work. But he appreciated the honesty nevertheless. The high stakes didn't faze me. Most clients were collectors. Awkward, but harmless. Their lives revolving around their treasures. The high-value stuff didn't bother me. I don't mean to sound cruel, but I was delivering to a lot of out-of-shaped nerds that barely saw sunlight. They weren't threats. Their passion more endearing than dangerous. Even if they did pull a gun on me and try to rob the card or whatever it was, I don't think they'd have the strength to pull the trigger or the eyesight to even hit me. A joke, but one rooted in truth until Vince's warning changed everything. The delivery was to a new address, a 7-Eleven parking lot, not a home. Vince's voice was tense, his usual confidence replaced by caution. "Be careful," he said, his words heavy, hinting at a risk I hadn't considered. I laughed it off, asking if he thought the buyer would rob me. He shrugged, non-committal, but his question lingered. "You armed?" My refusal was firm. No guns, no trouble. But his warning stuck, a seed of doubt in the evening's quiet. The lot was public, well lit, but empty. The store's neon glow, a false promise of safety. I waited, the card in my pocket, a magnet for trouble. My eyes scanning the shadows. A man moved by the dumpster, his erratic dance unsettling, his presence a warning I couldn't ignore. The buyer was late, the minutes stretching, each one tightening the knot in my gut. The man by the dumpster grew bolder, his movements sharper, and I wondered if Vince's caution was more than paranoia. The night was alive, and it wasn't friendly. Then, the buyer appeared, his hoodie and cap masking his face, his steps cautious but eager. The exchange was quick, the card a prize that lit his eyes, but his careless jest sparked a fire, and the night turned deadly. The dumpster man's rage unleashed, but the trust that formed also led him to trust me with more and more valuable items, until this particular time, when he said the card in my possession was worth almost $1,000. The card was a rare find, a collector's dream, and I felt its weight, not just in value, but in responsibility. I wasn't scared of getting robbed, not until my nerd guy said something about me having to be careful. Vince's tone was off, his usual banter replaced by a quiet urgency. I asked why I'd need to be careful, and he told me no particular reason. It was just a delivery to a new address, so we weren't familiar with the buyer. The address was a 7-Eleven parking lot, not a home, and the buyer's secrecy, refusing to share his address, set my nerves on edge. I asked if he thought the guy might try and rob me, and he said no. But he also then asked if I was armed during the deliveries. The question was a jolt, his suggestion absurd. I said, "Hell no, dude, I don't need to be, do I?" At which point he shrugged and said, "Maybe you should think about it." There was no way that I was risking gun charges just to deliver this dude's Pokemon cards. And the way he talked had me assuming that he was just exaggerating the risk to sound cool. I dismissed it, but the seed was planted, my confidence shaken. The buyer asked to meet me in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven, which was apparently just around the corner from his apartment. The location was public, but its openness felt like a trap, a stage for trouble. He didn't want to give his exact address because he had a collection worth hundreds of thousands. So, he'd only meet me in the 7-Eleven parking lot. He said, "Now, right away." I'm thinking, I don't like this. The lot was too exposed, too quiet. The store's lights a thin shield against the night. The meet was a public space, well lit, too. But that wouldn't matter to some crackhead who'd worked out that robbing card couriers could bag him a heck of a lot of money. My mind raced, imagining threats in every shadow, and the amount of time that I was left waiting had me on edge. 2. Because most buyers were super excited to get their cards or games or merch or whatever, and never left you hanging for long. I got even more on edge when some shirtless homeless dude started practicing his kung fu over by a dumpster, because if he started practicing it on my car, then we were going to have problems. His movements were erratic, a dance of unpredictability, his presence a growing threat, not just for the obvious reasons either, but because it might mess up the delivery. I needed this job, needed the money, and his chaos was a distraction I couldn't afford. I told myself just a few more minutes, and then I was driving back to my nerd guy and chalking it up to a no-show. My patience was thinning, the night growing darker, the lot emptier. But then, just as the streetlights flickered on, some dude in a hoodie and a baseball cap started walking over to my car, very sketchy-like. His approach was cautious, his face obscured, and my heart skipped, expecting trouble. I'm looking at this dude thinking, you do not look like my usual customer. But after he slides into my passenger seat and I make sure his money's good, I gave him his card, and it was like I'd handed him a holy relic. His excitement was genuine, his eyes bright with awe, and I relaxed, chiding myself for my paranoia. His eyes lit up as he looked at it through the plastic wrapper, and I was silently mad at myself for assuming this guy was some scumbag when his money was good. And it was actually kind of cool. And just before he got out of my car, he pointed towards the homeless guy and says, "Is that dude with you?" His tone was light, curious, and I laughed, shaking my head. But I just sort of scoffed and said no, but told him he was great entertainment while I waited. The homeless man's antics were a strange sideshow, harmless in the moment. And then, after thanking me for the delivery, the guy got out of my car and started walking back towards the 7-Eleven. I started my car, put her into drive, and then right when I did, the buyer yelled something at the homeless guy, did a few kung fu moves back at him, and then started walking away laughing to himself. The jest was playful, a mimicry of the man's odd dance, but it was a spark in a powder keg. He was making fun of him, all right, but it wasn't malicious, more playful than anything else. But the homeless guy did not see it that way. The air shifted, the homeless man's movement stopping, his eyes locking onto the buyer with a fury that chilled me. He turned to the dumpster, his hands digging, searching, and I knew something was wrong. Something was coming. My car idled, my eyes fixed on him, my gut screaming to act. Then, the glint of metal, a machete, pulled from the trash, its blade catching the streetlight. He moved, fast, a predator unleashed, charging the buyer who walked unaware, his laughter fading into the night. I slammed the horn, 3 sharp blasts, a desperate warning. The buyer turned, saw the blade, and stumbled, his panic a mirror of my own. Instinct took over, my foot on the gas, the car surging forward, headlights pinning the attacker in their glare. He froze, a deer in the light, and then, impact. The machete clattered to the ground, the man a crumpled heap, blood pooling beneath him. The lot erupted, voices shouting, eyes accusing, and I stood, trembling, wondering if I'd saved a life or taken one. The buyer's voice cut through, defending me, explaining the truth. The night blurred. Cops, paramedics, questions. But the footage saved me. The truth a fragile shield against the chaos that had almost consumed us all. And after giving the buyer a death stare for a few seconds, he starts rummaging in the dumpster like he's looking for something. His movements were frantic, purposeful, and my unease grew. I stopped to watch him from my driver's seat, kind of thinking, okay, why do I really not like the look of this? My instincts screamed danger. The night's calm shattered. And then, that gut feeling explained itself when the homeless dude pulls out a machete out of the dumpster and started running full speed at the buyer, who had absolutely no idea what was coming. I honked my horn 3 times real fast, trying to alert the buyer to what was coming for him. The sound was desperate, piercing, but the buyer's reaction was slow, his body turning just as the blade gleamed. Then, when he realized what was happening, he freaked out so hard that he fell right on his face trying to get a sprint going. His fall was clumsy, his panic raw, the machete closing in. I guess instinct kicked in for me, because out of nowhere, I'm putting my foot down and just sending it towards this homeless dude. The car roared, a beast unleashed, my hand steady despite the fear. He sees the headlights, and then he's almost like a deer, freezes, and then the next thing, wham! And he just sort of disappears from view. The impact was sudden, the world tilting, the man gone from sight. Literally. The first thought that comes into my head is, holy, I think I just killed a guy, and people are now coming out of the store and freaking out, thinking I just murdered this dude out of nowhere. The crowd grew, their voices a cacophony of shock and accusation, their eyes judging me a killer. I opened up the door and got out to see the damage, and the shirtless homeless dude is just split on the concrete. His body was still, blood seeping from a gash on his head, the machete a silent witness nearby. There's a bunch of blood leaking out of a gash to his head. Some people are yelling for someone to call 911, while others are walking up to me saying, "What the hell did you just do?" Their anger was palpable, their misunderstanding a weight on my chest. Luckily, he jumps in right away and lets everyone know what happened, and how this crazy shirtless dude had been hiding a goddamn machete in the dumpster. The buyer's voice was a lifeline, his truth cutting through the chaos, saving me from the crowd's wrath, probably just waiting for someone to mess with him. The cops showed up quick, then the paramedics, and when they took the homeless dude away, he was still out of it. The scene was a blur, lights flashing, voices overlapping, the man's fate uncertain. He was detained in the parking lot until the cops reviewed the security camera footage in the 7-Eleven. The footage was my salvation, a silent witness to the truth. And then, once they saw me and the buyer were telling the truth about what had happened, they said I was free to go. I ended up going into the 7-Eleven to buy a pack of smokes, which was me quitting smoking for like the 7th time. The clerk's hands shook as he rang me up, his eyes wide with awe. And as I bought the pack, the guy behind the counter said I was a hero. His words were a balm, a fleeting comfort in the chaos. He said it was him who showed the cops the footage, and if it wasn't for me, the buyer would have been screwed. That shirtless homeless guy had been hanging around the store for months, and given his history of threatening interactions, both he and his coworkers agreed it was only a matter of time before he did something serious. The clerk's story painted a picture of a man on the edge, a ticking bomb I'd unknowingly diffused. That was kind of reassuring. But the relief was tainted by doubt. The night's violence a stain I couldn't wash away. But what wasn't reassuring was something one of the cops said to me before I was free to leave. His voice was low, his words a warning. A detective might call. And if the man died, I'd need a lawyer. He said I was probably going to get a call from a detective, in which case I should lawyer up before talking to anyone, especially if that guy dies. The possibility hung over me, a shadow of consequence for an act of instinct. Well, lucky for me, the homeless dude didn't die. He survived, his head stitched, his hospital stay brief before he vanished into the city's underbelly. He had to have his head stitched up, and he spent a couple days in the hospital before being released. No charges were filed, the truth clear in the footage. But after that, he disappeared, and there was no pressing charges. I still had to talk to the cops again just to get the story straight. The questions were routine, but each one was a reminder of how close I'd come to ruin. But after that, they told me I was home free and that I wouldn't be hearing from them again. The relief was overwhelming. A weight lifted, but the scars remained. That was a huge relief, because for a while I was convinced that this sick twist of fate was going to occur where my attempt to save a person's life had destroyed my own. Thankfully, that didn't occur, and nothing that wild ever happened again on any other delivery. The job continued, but the joy was gone. Each trip a reminder of that night. But even today, with a large homeless population around here, I still find myself getting super on edge whenever I see one crashing out. The city's streets were a gallery of broken lives, and I saw that man in every shadow, his machete a ghost that haunted me. I know they're not all bad, and that life just beats some people down. But I think we can all agree that people with nothing left to lose can be very, very dangerous. The lesson was hard learned. The night a crucible that forged a fear I'd never shake. A reminder that even the simplest job could turn deadly in an instant. The House of Shadows. The street was quiet, too quiet, as I pulled my truck up to a house that looked like it had given up on life. My toolbox rattled in the passenger seat, a familiar companion in my days as a Craigslist handyman. A long time ago, back when I was still a broke high school dropout, I used to advertise handyman services on Craigslist. The gigs paid well, enough to keep me from chasing a real business. But each job dragged me deeper into places I didn't belong. This house, with its trash-strewn lawn and grimy windows, felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. This is the story of a job that went from routine to a brush with death, and the shadow that changed everything. The work had started simple. Fix a sink, hang a door, patch a wall. It was actually a pretty good moneymaker for a while. So much that it delayed me starting an actual business because I was making so much money. But the houses I visited grew stranger, their owners odder, until I wondered what I was walking into. But over time, the places I was hitting up got weirder and weirder, until eventually I had to quit working Craigslist jobs altogether. People asked if one job broke me, and I always came back to this one. People sometimes ask if there was one specific job, one specific straw which broke the mule's back. It started with a call from a man named Jerry, needing shelves hung. One day, I get a call from a dude about putting up some shelves in his place. He's got the shelves. He's got a place he wants them, and he just doesn't have the tools or the skills to put them up. I agreed, expecting a quick job. So, he gives me a call. We arranged for a time for me to drive over. The house loomed as I turned onto the street, a sinking feeling settling in. Then, I get there with my toolbox for what I figured would be a 30-minute job. But then, the second I turned on the street and saw which house I was working in, I started getting one of those weird sinking feelings. Trash littered the lawn. A rusted car sat wheelless in the driveway. That place was a total mess. There's trash on the lawn. There's a rusted car with no wheels propped up in the driveway. The windows were caked with years of neglect, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. I'd seen rough places before, but this was different. Like I said, I had the bad luck of being called out to a bunch of different houses like that. Some homes belonged to the sick or elderly, but this wasn't that. It was decay, deliberate and deep, and I was starting to get real goddamn sick of it, too. I'm not talking about folks too sick or ill to take care of themselves. I understand that not everyone has the time or energy to keep their places looking like something off of an HOA leaflet. Jerry greeted me, a wiry man with a nervous edge, saying his Aunt Janie was asleep. But when a place is so dirty that there's actual fleas hopping around the furniture, you really wanted to ask a person, "How the hell can you live like this, man? What's wrong with you?" And this guy was that type. This guy, I'll just call him Jerry, said that he lived with his Aunt Janie and that we had to be quiet because she was sleeping. I hesitated, hammer in hand. I told him, "Dude, maybe this isn't the best time for me to be hammering walls if your aunt is asleep." He brushed it off, insistent, but he assured me it was fine. And since the job would be a quick one, she wouldn't mind the interruption. I shrugged, following him inside. And I'm saying something like, "Whatever you say, boss." And then I follow him inside and out to a back room, which is where he wanted the shelves put up. The back room was dim, cluttered, and there, on a couch, was a blanket-covered shape. But then right there on the couch next to where he wants me to put the shelves up is a pile of blankets with a very human-looking shape underneath. My stomach twisted. The second I saw it, I whispered, "Dude, that's not your Aunt Janie, is it?" He nodded, casual, and then he nodded and said, "Yep," I protested, worried about noise, and I told him there's no way that I was hammering the wall right next to her without waking her up. Jerry waved it away, but something felt wrong. And then, right as he's giving me some explanation about how it's fine and she won't mind, something hits me. The blanket was too still, too complete. I start thinking, who the hell's sleeping totally covered up like that? A chill ran through me, and I'm making my way across the room towards the shelves when I suddenly realize Aunt Janie isn't asleep. Is she? I turned, words forming. But Jerry was moving. I turned to say something to Jerry. He slid a car battery in front of the door, his calm voice a lie. I can't quite remember what now, but I turned to see him sliding something heavy in front of the door. I questioned him, my voice steady. I asked what he's doing, and he tells me the hinge is loose, and he needs the car battery in front of it to stop it swinging open. His excuse was flimsy, his eyes betraying him. He tries staying all calm and convincing, but I can smell bull crap immediately. He wanted me trapped. The only reason he wanted to put that thing in the way was to keep me from being able to get out of there fast. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, or in other words, he wanted me trapped. In seconds, the job had turned deadly. To this day, how quickly and how strangely the situation escalated is something that's never been topped for me. I realized Janie wasn't sleeping. She was gone. And Jerry was no innocent client. In the space of maybe 30 seconds, I went from this poor lady's getting her nap interrupted to realizing she was most likely taking a permanent nap at the hands of the guy I'd just been swapping small talk with. Jerry bent down, grabbing a metal pipe, his grip tight. 1 minute I was there to put up some shelves. The next, I wasn't sure if I was getting out of there alive, because right after Jerry tells me that lie about the door not closing properly, he bends down and picks up this hefty-looking metal pipe. I played it cool, my voice light. I ask him, "What's that for?" trying to stay as cool as possible. He lied again, his words hollow, and he responds, "Oh, this thing. Nothing. Just picking it up so you don't trip over it." The pipe was a weapon, not a courtesy, but he's holding it tight in his hand like a weapon. I needed an out. Fast. So, I knew he wasn't doing anything out of courtesy for me. My gun was at home. Useless now. I knew I had to think on my feet, and find some excuse to get out of there that didn't provoke him into trying to hit me with that pipe. I had to arm myself, but I also knew that there was a real good chance that the guy was going to get violent with me, in which case I had to arm myself. I had a gun at home at the time for home defense, but I didn't go carrying it around with me. Not always. Anyway, I reached for my toolbox, my fingers closing around a claw hammer. So, at first I say, well, let me see which tools I need for this. And the first thing I pull out of my bag is my claw hammer. I feigned ignorance, eyeing the shelves. I then take a look at the shelves, while playing extremely dumb. I babbled about noise, stalling, and then I ask him something along the lines of, I think this is going to wake up your Aunt Janie and make a real mad dude. I'm a heavy sleeper myself, but I got to tell you that I'd be waking up with someone hammering on a wall right next to my head. Jerry relaxed, my act convincing, and I couldn't believe what he did next. I saw him start relaxing again once I started playing dumb. I kept talking, sowing doubt. It was obvious that whoever was under the blanket wasn't just sleeping, but since my best chance of avoiding conflict was playing along, that's what I did. I mentioned Janie's rest, her health. I tell him about his aunt waking up and how it's not a good idea if she's sick or needs rest or whatever. Jerry moved to the couch, his actions surreal. And then this guy walks over to the couch saying, "Nah, it's all right." He lifted the blanket, shouting, and then lifts up the blanket and starts yelling, "Janie, wake up!" A cloth covered her face, a grotesque mask. She's got a washcloth or something covering her face, but just her face, like a death mask. The sight burned into me, chilling. It might sound kind of weird, but I think that was the creepiest thing about this entire exchange. Her stillness was final, her face erased. Seeing this poor old lady with just her face covered after he'd pulled back the blanket. The pipe in his hand felt heavier now. Remembering him pick up that metal pipe kind of just makes me mad to think about these days. That cloth, that act. It was wrong. But the image of that piece of cloth or whatever it was, covering up her face like he'd sort of, I don't know, taken her face away from her, it creeps me out. I forced a laugh, playing along. Something awful. Anyway, I still got no chance but to keep playing along. So that's what I keep doing, I remember saying. Damn, she is a heavy sleeper, huh? Jerry's lie deepened, his voice unsteady. And then he says, I told you, man, she's sick. She's not going to wake up. It's cool. He hadn't mentioned sickness before. He had not mentioned anything about her being sick, and that was literally the first time. I nodded, hammer in hand, scanning for an exit. But still, I just play along with my hammer and my hand. And then I go back to looking through my toll box and trying to think of another excuse. Jerry watched, his pipe a threat. That was probably the most at risk I felt, because I'm watching Jerry out of the corner of my eye, thinking if he rushes me right now, I'm screwed because I'm kneeling down with my back to him. I needed a bluff, something believable. I guess that kind of hurried my thought process along, because the next thing I remember saying, damn it, I think I brought the wrong brackets. Jerry frowned, confused. He gave me a confused look as I stand up again and turned to him. So I knew that I was in the clear in terms of being able to bluff him, which was a huge relief. But I still wasn't out of the woods just yet. I spun a tale about needing special brackets. He says, huh, brackets? My words were nonsense, but he bought it. And so I start explaining I need this special little wooden bracket if I was going to drill into the plaster. It was total nonsense. I could have used whatever the hell kind of bracket I had with me, but Jerry didn't know that, so that's what I went with. I offered to grab them from my truck. I told him all I needed to do was head out to my trunk to get them, and even volunteered to leave my toolbox there because I wasn't going anywhere, and I'd be right back once I grabbed them from my trunk. The toolbox was my sacrifice, a decoy. It hurt knowing that I was about to lose them. That was a couple of $100 in tools at least. But I also knew that that was sort of my ace in the hole when it came to getting out that door, because it completely fooled Jerry into thinking that I was going to be right back. Jerry moved the battery, opening the door. He steps out of the way of the door, moves the car battery so I can actually open it. I walked out, calm, my heart pounding. And then I walk back out to the truck. The truck was my salvation. I don't suspect a thing, and I'ma be right back. I slid into the driver's seat, engine roaring. But then the second I get to my truck, I'm in the driver's seat and gunning the engine like my life depended on it. I sped away, the house shrinking in my mirror. A few minutes later, I'm pulling into the parking lot of a strip mall and calling 911. I told the dispatcher everything, my voice shaking. I told the dispatcher everything, and she told me if there really was a dead body involved, I was probably going to get a call back from the cops sometime. She was right. Janie was dead. And she was right. Just like I suspected. Aunt Janie was dead. And it meant I needed to be fingerprinted so the cops could distinguish mine from anyone else's. The truth was stranger than I'd feared. I figured right then that it must have been murder, and that Jerry was some psycho who murdered that lady before taking up residence in her home. But Jerry wasn't a killer. But that's not actually what happened. He had severe learning difficulties, raised by his Aunt Janie. Jerry had learning difficulties, pretty serious ones too. And it was actually his aunt lying there dead on the couch. When she died, he couldn't let go. I don't know what happened to his mom and dad, but his aunt had been taking care of him all of his life. And then when she died, he just kind of lost it, refused to accept it, and only armed himself with that pipe because he thought I was going to separate him from his beloved Aunt Janie. I was a threat to his delusion. I mean, that's exactly what I was going to do. I could have pressed charges, but I didn't. So, I suppose I really was in danger once I was in that room with his dead aunt. But after the cops told me about his situation and how I had grounds to press charges for wrongful detainment, I just declined. Pity replaced fear. I felt bad for the guy. He didn't understand that his aunt was gone. Jerry's grief was his prison, not mine. Or if he did, he sure as hell wasn't ready to let her go. I'd have fought if he'd attacked. But he wasn't evil. Now, don't get it twisted. If he'd have come at me with that pipe, I'd have taken his goddamn head off. He was lost, broken. But finding out that he wasn't some monster, just a confused, heartbroken hermit with the mind of a child, that totally changed how I looked at it. That house, that moment, showed me the risk of my work. It made me realize how much danger I was putting myself in by visiting random homes like that. Each job was a step into someone's story, and some stories end in shadows. When I step inside, I become part of their world and part of their stories. And some people's stories don't have happy endings. I quit Craigslist that day. My toolbox a small price for my life. The revolver's curse. The revolver gleamed in its dusty box, a relic of another time. But when Rick held it, his eyes turned black. His hand trembled, and I knew it wasn't just a gun. It was a curse, and I was in its path. I ran, barbecue bags forgotten, as gunshots echoed behind me. Rick wasn't Rick anymore, his face twisted, blood dripping. The antique pistol had claimed him, and I was next if I didn't escape. The garage was a tomb of junk, but the real danger was the 6-shooter we found. It whispered to Rick, turned him against me, and left me wondering if its shadow still lingers in Abilene. He stood frozen, the gun raised, fighting an unseen force. Blood poured from his nose, his eye a void. I bolted, but the revolver's power stayed with me. A chill I can't shake. A simple job turned deadly when we unearthed a pistol that wasn't just old, it was alive. Rick's scream followed me out, and I'm still haunted by what that gun wanted. Almost 25 years ago now. When I first moved to Abilene, I had a job prospect completely fall through on me. The promise of steady work in the oil fields had lured me to this dusty Texas town, but the deal collapsed before I even unpacked. I had rent to pay, groceries, and gas to buy, and since I only had a couple of $100 in savings to tide me over, I was very stressed about it. The weight of survival pressed hard. Each dollar stretched thin, my future uncertain in a place I barely knew. But as luck would have it, I'd somehow managed to find myself an awesome roommate to live with, and he turned out to be a huge help. Daryl was a lanky guy with a quick smile, his apartment cluttered with computers and cables, a stark contrast to the sleepy town around us. Daryl was a big computer nerd at the time when not everyone was hooked up to the internet. His screens glowed with forums and early websites, a digital oasis in a world still tied to paper. So, when I told him all about my money troubles, he said that he'd try his best to find me some respectable employment. I didn't think there was much that he could do. I mean, this was the early 2000s, so job websites were practically non-existent back then. The internet was a clunky novelty, and job hunting meant scouring newspapers or pounding pavement. But to my surprise, and within just a few short hours of his promise, Daryl delivered. He called me over to his desk, his eyes bright with triumph. When he told me he'd found something suitable, I was halfway to telling him I'm not standing outside a bank dressed as a dollar bill. The image of myself in a foam costume made me grimace, but Daryl's laugh cut through my doubt. But he just laughed and pointed at his computer screen before telling me to read through the post. Basically, a guy on Craigslist was offering $100 a day to anyone who'd help him clear out the garage of an old house he just purchased. And they didn't require anything but a can-do attitude and a willingness to work hard. The ad was simple, almost too good to be true. But the money was a lifeline. At the time, it seemed like great money for a simple job. So I rushed to contact the guy before someone else did. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my email brief but eager. It turns out the guy's name was Rick, and he made his money flipping old houses around Abilene. His voice over the phone was warm, confident, the kind of guy who knew his trade. He seemed like an okay dude, too. So once he was happy that I was the right guy for the job, we arranged a date and time for me to drive over to the house. The house was on the edge of town, a weathered Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by overgrown oaks. I got there just before 8 o'clock. The morning was cool, the sun barely cresting the horizon. Then Rick and I had ourselves some coffee before he showed me the garage. Rick was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with a handshake that could crush walnuts. He handed me a chipped mug, the coffee bitter, but welcome. As we chatted about the house's history, old, neglected, but full of potential, it was only then that it made sense why he was offering $100 a day. To say the place was a mess would be the understatement of the century. The garage was a chaos of neglect, its door half buried under rusted tools and broken furniture. The trash was literally floor to ceiling in the back corners. Piles of junk loomed like forgotten monuments, their surfaces gray with dust, like these miniature mountains of old toys, furniture, and appliances that were covered in dust and cobwebs. A doll with one eye stared blankly. A toaster's cord dangled like a noose. The whole floor was covered in it. And we had to haul out a ton of old crap just to be able to walk our way into the garage. The work was grueling. Our hands caked with grime as we dragged out warped boards and shattered lamps. Everything that was straight up trash went into a dumpster Rick had rented, whereas anything we figured that we might be able to renovate got lined up in the driveway. A chipped dresser, a wobbly chair, each piece was a gamble, a chance at profit. And then after a couple of hours, we managed to uncover some cabinets that lined one of the walls. The cabinets were oak, their handles tarnished but solid. Hidden beneath layers of debris, Rick starts opening them up to see what's in there. And then he sort of rummages around for a minute before saying, "Well, what do we have here?" His voice was light, curious, as he reached deeper, and he pulled out a wooden box about half the size of a shoebox. And even though it was covered in dust and dirt, I could see how fancy it was. The box was intricately carved, its edges worn but elegant, the wood dark with age. Rick sets it down and opened it up, and inside is what looked like some kind of antique six-shooter with similarly fancy engravings on it. The revolver gleamed, its barrel etched with swirling patterns, the handle ivory or bone, smooth. And while cold, Rick started saying how it might be silver-plated, but even if not, it still had to be worth a few $1,000 at auction. His eyes sparkled. To find a treasure in the trash. And by looking at it, I had to agree. That thing looked like it should have been in a museum or something. It was pristine, untouched by the garage's decay, as if waiting to be found. And I had no doubt in my mind that a collector would pay top dollar for it. Maybe even more if its original owner had been someone famous or historical. The gun felt like history, heavy with stories we couldn't know. I congratulated him on his find, and then got back to work, hauling stuff out of the garage. My arms ached, but the discovery had lit a spark. The day suddenly brighter. The revolver stayed in my mind, its shine a lure, but something about it felt off, a whisper I couldn't hear. Now, we continued on working for the next couple of hours. The sun climbed, the air growing thick with dust and heat. Then, Rick asked if I was hungry. My stomach growled, loud enough to answer for me. I was so starved I could have eaten my own fist. The morning's labor had drained me, my muscles screaming. When I agreed it was time for a lunch break, Rick gave me $50 and said if I drove to his favorite barbecue place, lunch was on him and I could keep the change. The offer was generous, the cash crisp in my hand. And let me tell you, barbecue always tastes better when it's free. There's a science to it. It has to be. And so I took his $50, bought a bunch of barbecue, and then drove back to the house with 2 bags full of brisket, links, pickles, and potato salad. The smell filled my car, rich and smoky, a promise of relief. I parked my car, then started walking up the driveway. The house loomed, its windows dark, the garage a gaping maw of junk. And here's where you kind of need to know something about the setup. There was a crap ton of junk piled up against the garage door, and we weren't even halfway through clearing out all that crap yet. The pile was a barrier, forcing me to navigate around it. So, I had to walk all the way around this big old garage to the back door to get inside. And so, there I go, hauling these 2 big bags of barbecue. The bags were heavy, the grease soaking through, my arms straining. Then, when I got to the doorway, there's Rick with his back to me. He stood in the garage's dim light, motionless, his shoulders rigid. I tell him, "Hey, man, back with lunch. But he doesn't turn around. Not right away. The silence was wrong. Heavy. His lack of response a crack in the day's rhythm. And I don't know exactly what it was about him, but I remember getting this bad feeling right there when he didn't respond to me. My skin prickled. The air suddenly cold. We'd been working all morning and well into the afternoon, too. And if he felt anything like I did, then the fact that he didn't turn around and jump at the bag of food was just weird. I gave it maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then called out to him again, saying, "Yo, Rick, I'm back. What's the holdup? Let's eat." My voice was light, but my nerves were taut, and he kind of jerked his head to the side like he'd only just heard me, and then slowly started to turn around. The movement was unnatural, halting, as if pulled by strings. But as he did, I noticed the open box on a dusty counter nearby, the one that held that 6-shooter. Only now the box was empty, and the bullets were gone. The revolver's absence was a void, its implications chilling. Seconds later, I see the gun in his hand, but I see this little trickle of blood coming out of his nose. 2, his face was wrong, his nose bleeding, his eye a bloodshot ruin, black and empty, staring through me, and one of his eyes was very bloodshot. And I'm not talking like smoking reefer bloodshot either. I'm talking smashed in the face with a baseball bat kind of bloodshot. Like so bloodshot it almost looked black. The sight was grotesque, his face a mask of pain and something darker. I figured he was going through some kind of medical emergency, and I was about to ask if he needed me to call 911. My hand reached for my phone, my voice ready to offer help. But then the next thing he kind of halfway raises that 6-shooter to point it at me, but then stops himself. The gun trembled, his arm shaking, as if fighting an unseen force. I can see him struggling like he's fighting the urge or something. So without another thought, I just dropped the bags, turned, and ran like hell. The barbecue hit the ground, sauce spilling, as I bolted. I bolted it all the way out to my car, hearing 2 loud gunshots, and then this almighty crash along the way. The shots were deafening, the crash a cacophony of falling junk. I remember thinking that he must have fell into a pile of junk to make that kind of crash. The image was vivid. Rick stumbling into the chaos we'd unearthed. I was just about to book it. 2, because I didn't want to be there if Rick got up and came out shooting again. My car keys were in my hand, the engine's promise of escape close. But then I realized that if I did just up and leave without warning anyone, it would be on me if someone ended up getting shot. The thought was a weight, a duty I couldn't ignore. I had my own gun in my glove compartment, so I grabbed it, kept my eyes trained on the garage and the pathway leading from it, and then started whistling double loud till someone appeared asking what the hell was going on. A neighbor emerged, her face pale, her phone already in hand. I told them to call the cops and EMS because someone had gone crazy and they had a gun. She nodded, disappearing inside, her voice urgent as she dialed. They rushed back inside, and then not long after, I heard sirens getting louder before the cop car skidded around the corner. The patrol car's lights flashed, a beacon of order. I put my gun away before they got out, and then once they did, I directed the 2 officers toward the garage where Rick still was. My voice was steady, pointing them to the back door. They appeared around the side, and then I hear them yelling things like, "Police, come out with your hands up." Their commands were sharp, authoritative, cutting through the air. I didn't hear any shots, which gave me hope. The silence was a fragile promise, a chance for survival. Then, one of the cops came out saying Rick needed an ambulance, and I was relieved to hear that he wasn't outright dead. The words were a relief, a crack in the terror, but I was still very worried about him for obvious reasons. He looked in a bad way when I saw him. The blood, the eye, the gun, they haunted me. Nose all bloody with his eyes all messed up. So he was obviously hurting in some way. His pain was palpable, a mystery I couldn't unravel. But then the way he'd almost had to fight himself to keep from shooting me, that made me think something had gone wrong in his brain. The struggle was eerie, as if he'd been possessed, not just sick. And somehow, even though I almost just took a bullet from an antique pistol, the idea of poor old Rick losing his mind in some way was even scarier to me than the idea of getting shot. The loss of self, the betrayal of one's own body, was a horror deeper than violence. And once EMS had arrived and the cops had secured that gun, one of them came over to talk to me about what had happened. The officer was calm, his notepad ready, his questions precise. I told him everything from start to finish. How Rick had been a perfectly nice dude right up until he hadn't. And how whatever happened to him seemed to happen right as I got back. The timing was too perfect. Too wrong. I knew that because the blood coming out of his nose hadn't even started dripping off his chin yet. But aside from that, I didn't know a thing about what happened to Rick or why he started acting the way he did. The revolver loomed in my mind, its engravings a silent accusation. I saw the EMS guys wheeling Rick to an ambulance. He didn't look conscious, and he had one of those oxygen mask things on. His face was pale, the mask fogging with each shallow breath. I kept asking EMTs if he was going to be okay, but they said they didn't know. Their uncertainty was a weight, a reminder of how close we'd come to tragedy. After I got into my car and drove home. That was pretty much the last I heard of it for about a month. The drive was a blur, the barbecue smell still clinging to my clothes. A bitter reminder. And then, out of the blue, Rick gives me a call. His voice was soft, apologetic, a shadow of the man I'd met. He said he was sorry for frightening me and wanted to stop by my place to give me the $100 he owed me for the day's work, even though I only did half. I waved it off, relieved to hear he was alive. I told him that wasn't necessary and that I was just glad to hear that it was okay. But he insisted on stopping over to thank me in person because if it wasn't for me, he might not be alive. His gratitude was heavy, sincere. I told him if that was the case, he was free to stop by whenever he liked. The invitation was genuine, a bridge between us. And when he did, he had more than just $100 for me. He arrived with an envelope, its weight surprising. When he stopped by, Rick told me what the doctor said. He told them he started feeling funny right around the time he picked up the gun. The revolver had been a trigger, its touch a spark. He'd been bored waiting for me to come back with lunch and decided to get out that 6-shooter again. The act was casual, but its consequences weren't. But that's where things started getting a little hazy. When he saw me in the doorway, he got scared because he didn't recognize who I was. His mind had fractured, my face a stranger's. And then once he did, he was already halfway to pointing the gun at me. The urge was foreign, a command not his own. And like I suspected, it was like he had to battle himself not to do it. Like his brain and body were arguing back and forth with each other. Last thing he said he remembered was seeing me run off. After that, he didn't remember nothing till he woke up in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The gap was a void, a loss of self. I sat there with my jaw on the floor. The story was unreal, a nightmare made flesh. And even now, I can't really imagine how that must have felt for him, losing control of your own body. And that's scarier than anything from any horror movie, at least anything I've ever seen. The horror was intimate, a violation of will. Anyway, when he was done telling me about the medical side of things, Rick turned and reached into his jacket that he had slung over my kitchen chair. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if proving he was himself again. He then pulled out an envelope that contained way more than just $100. The bills were crisp, a fortune in my hands. When I realized how much money was in there, easily over $2,000, he started telling me about putting that gun he found up for auction. The revolver had sold quickly, its value immense. He didn't tell me how much that thing actually sold for. He said some collector stepped in before he even hit the podium and offered almost double the buyout price just to secure it as theirs. And I remember laughing and saying, "I knew it. I knew that thing looked expensive." The laugh was hollow, the gun's shadow still dark. And then, as much as I wanted to turn down his offer of the money, Lord knows I needed it. The cash was a lifeline, a way to breathe again. Rick then said something about how, if it wasn't for me, he might not be alive to put the gun up for auction in the first place. His words were earnest, a debt he felt deeply, and he figured the least he could do was share some of his unexpected earnings with the man who saved his life. And I don't think I'd go that far personally. The doctors and nurses and paramedics saved Rick's life. Their skill had pulled him back, not me. Whereas I was just about ready to shoot him if he appeared from that garage pointing that pistol. The gun in my glove box had been a last resort, my fear a mirror of his. So I don't think I can claim too much credit, but I guess I did help get the ambulance there in a roundabout way by calling the cops. My actions had rippled, saving more than I'd meant to. So, I understood where he was coming from. After that, we went our separate ways, and he'd been a memory ever since. Rick faded into the past, a story told over beers. I still think about him from time to time, though, wondering how he's doing, and if that medical thing ever flared up again. His recovery was a fragile hope, a question unanswered. But I also think about how it was a hell of a time for it to kick in for the first time. Right when I was coming back with lunch, and he was holding that gun. The timing was too precise, too cruel. 'Cause maybe on another day, the cops show up hours, maybe even days later, and we're both lying there dead as doornails. All because the wrong thing happened in the wrong place at the wrong time. The revolver's gone, sold to a collector. But its curse lingers in my dreams, a reminder that some objects hold more than history. They hold power, and I'm lucky it let us go. The bark from below. The promise of freedom came in the form of my dad's old Dodge, its keys dangling just out of reach, contingent on me earning my own gas money. In my senior year of high school, my dad said that if I got myself a job to pay for gas money, he'd give me the keys to his old Dodge. Craigslist became my treasure map, sparked by a friend's success with babysitting gigs. Then, when a friend of mine said that she'd found babysitting jobs on Craigslist, I started looking there to see if I could find anything nearby. Then I stumbled upon something unexpected: dog sitting, a job that felt tailor-made for me. But while I was looking, I found a kind of sitting job that was somehow both very familiar and very different to babysitting. Dog sitting. I had no babysitting experience. But dogs? Dogs I knew. This was my chance to break free. The ad was a golden ticket, an $80 payout for just 4 hours in a mansion nestled in the wealthiest part of town. The address was a real nice part of town, with big front lawns. 3-story homes with things like fountains or statues in the driveway. The job was to watch Rufus, a hyperactive Great Dane, a beast of a dog that could dwarf me. They had a very boisterous, borderline hyperactive 2-year-old named Rufus, who was a Great Dane. The high pay should have screamed warning, but I saw only opportunity. First off, this ad was offering $80 for just 4 hours from 7 p.m. until 11 p.m. Wealthy folks always overpay, I reasoned, my greed blinding me to the red flags. I dialed the number, heart racing with anticipation. The woman's voice was syrupy sweet, painting Rufus as a lovable handful who needed careful handling. And the lady I spoke to was super nice, and we talked all about Rufus and what a handful he could be. She planned to confine him to the kitchen, a precaution for my safety given my small stature. She said that, in her opinion, the best course of action would be for her to lock Rufus in the home's kitchen with a bunch of food and water. I requested to meet him first, to build trust. I asked if I could meet him first, at least from the other side of the toddler gate that they installed in the kitchen. She agreed, but her tone hinted at caution, mentioning liability. The lady said that was fine. She just didn't want him up close just in case he knocked me down and I wanted to sue. Why so guarded? I wondered. But excitement drowned my doubts. The house was a palace, its marble fountain gleaming under the evening sky, a world apart from my modest life. I drove over in my dad's old Dodge, and the house was just as incredible as I expected it to be. The woman welcomed me, her smile disarming. But the absence of Rufus was a nagging void. The lady was just as nice. 2. Where was the dog I'd come to care for? I didn't want to be rude and interrupt, but literally the second she walked into the kitchen, I was thinking, "Where's Rufus?" She recited rules. No boys, no hot tub, no pay-per-view. Her voice calm but rehearsed. The lady went over all the house rules, which was pretty much all the standard stuff. No boys, no trying to fill the hot tub, and no ordering pay-per-views on the TV. Then she revealed Rufus was in the basement, not the kitchen, and without missing a beat, she says, "Rufus is in the basement." My stomach twisted. I pressed for a meeting, my instincts prickling, to which I respond, "Okay, well, can I meet him?" Her warmth vanished, replaced by a curt refusal, but her face kind of just drops a little before saying back, That won't be happening, I'm afraid." "Sorry," I argued, citing my experience and Rufus's comfort. There was a pause before I respond. That wasn't part of the agreement. I'd much prefer if you could introduce us a little, so he doesn't mind me being here while all of you head out." Her gaze hardened, her voice icy. But when I was done, she looked at me with this total stone-cold look in her eyes and told me, "No." The basement door stood silent, a barrier hiding something I couldn't name. What's down there? The silence from the basement was a heavy weight, unnatural for a house supposedly holding a lively Great Dane. I remember looking at the basement door and feeling super uneasy that all I could hear was silence. Dogs sense strangers. They bark, they sniff, they react. 90% of the time when a dog is locked away like that, and they know a stranger is in the house, they start barking and scratching. But there was nothing, not even a rustle. So, the fact that there was total silence coming from the other side had me questioning if there was even a dog down there to begin with. I challenged her, asking why Rufus was banished to such a place. The only thing I could think to ask was, "Why do you guys keep Rufus in the basement? Are you sure he's going to be okay down there?" Her response was sharp, almost aggressive, pointing to the door as if it answered everything. And she says, "There's the basement. Rufus is downstairs. All you have to do is keep your ears peeled for any signs of distress, and call us if there are any." What's so hard to understand? Her sudden shift in demeanor was a jolt. Her earlier charm a facade that crumbled under my questions. Sure, it was just a minor change to our arrangement. But what bothered me so much more was the way this woman's attitude just seemed to totally switch. My gut screamed to flee, every instinct on high alert. I think by then, my suspicion meter was dipping into the red zone. Alarm bells were blaring in my head, and it was like a whole Chinese Olympic opening ceremony of red flags waving in front of me. In a moment of boldness, I voiced my doubt. And then, without even me really thinking about it, I just blurted out, "Is there even a dog down there? Was Rufus a lie? A pretext for something darker?" I wasn't even fully invested in the idea that there wasn't a dog down there. She didn't flinch, her smile returning with an unsettling sweetness. Instead, her tone turned super sweet again and said something like, "Of course there's a dog down there. Sweetie, here, listen." She knocked on the basement door, calling out. Then she bangs her fist on the basement door and yells, "Rufus, you all right down there?" A sound followed. Barks, or so she intended me to believe. And then I heard oof, oof, oof coming from the basement. But it was wrong. Unmistakably human. A mimicry that chilled me to the core. Because if there's one thing I am 100% sure of from that encounter, it's that whatever made that wolf sound was not a dog. It was human. Her nervous glance betrayed her. The lady knew it was a person, and she knew that I knew it was a person down there. Too, our eyes locked, hers flickering with unease, mine wide with realization. I don't know if those pretend barks worked on other people, but they sure as hell didn't work on me, because after a few seconds of awkward eye contact, I turned around, walked out of that house, and made a beeline for my car. She called after me, her voice shifting from sharp insults to desperate offers of double the pay. I guess the lady figured that she could maybe shame me into coming back because she started yelling all this mean stuff as I sped away walking to my car. And then the last thing I heard before I zoomed off down the street was her offering to double the money that I was being paid. I didn't look back, my car's engine roaring as I fled. But honestly, she could have tripled it, quadrupled it even, and I'd still have wanted out of there faster than you can say that ain't no dog. Home was a sanctuary, but my dad's rage filled the room when I explained. When I got home, Dad obviously wanted to know why I was home early. And then, when I told him, he just about exploded and ran to the cops. He saw a predator's trap, where I saw deception. His complaint boiled down to, "These slippery sons have tried to trick my little girl into being alone in a house with some weirdo down in the basement." The police investigated, finding only a cluttered basement, no trace of a dog or anyone else. They called back the next day saying they'd inspected the basement and that nothing was going on. There was no dog bed down there, no people either. Just a regular old basement full of junk and old boxes. They commended my decision to leave. They did, however, make it clear that if I hadn't felt safe there, I'd done the right thing and walking away. My dad's warnings took on new weight. His skepticism about online jobs now validated. Dad told me that stuff like that is why he'd been so nervous about the idea of me staying in people's houses. Most people are decent, he insisted. But one bad actor can ruin everything. He said most folks are good, kind-hearted people who want quiet, peaceful lives. But it only takes one single solitary individual to ruin a good thing and spoil it for everybody else. Trust is a mask somewhere to hide their truth. He also said there's sometimes a difference between what people present themselves as and who they really are. That house was a lesson in deception, a warning to look beyond the surface. And that's exactly how they lure girls like me into their homes on the pretext of something innocent. I abandoned dog sitting. The risks too great. The memory of that night too vivid. All I know is that it made me much more careful when it came to the kind of jobs I took before eventually making me give it up altogether. The mansion's allure was a lie. its secrets locked in a basement I'll never see. I don't know exactly what that family's deal was, if that person was down there of their own free will, or if something much, much darker was going on. Was it a scam, a prank, or something worse? Most homes are filled with good people, but find that one in 1,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever it might be, and you don't get out alive. I escaped, but the echo of those false barks haunts me, a reminder to always trust my instincts. The incident reshaped my path, steering me towards safer ventures, like my dog grooming business in upstate New York. These days, I run a dog grooming and walking service in upstate New York. Dogs remain my world, but I control the terms now, no longer stepping into strangers' homes. And dogs are my whole entire universe right now. That night taught me to question, to probe, to never ignore the quiet that speaks louder than words. I knew I wanted to leave right then and there. The woman's voice, her shifting demeanor, the basement's silence. They were signs I couldn't unsee. Alarm bells were blaring in my head, and it was like a whole Chinese Olympic opening ceremony of red flags waving in front of me. Looking back, I see the layers of deception, the high pay, the prestigious address, the friendly facade. I was even more the fool. I guess, because that's what had me responding to this one ad without any reservations at all. My greed, my excitement, nearly cost me. So, being greedy, I read on, and instantly I understood why they were offering so much cash. The Great Dane was a lure, a fiction to draw me in. And for those that don't know, and I guess the clue is kind of in the name, but Great Danes are, well, great. They're big dogs, but no dog waited in that house, only questions and shadows. I don't know if those pretend barks worked on other people, but they sure as hell didn't work on me. The police found nothing, but their empty report didn't erase my certainty. They called back the next day, saying they'd inspected the basement and that nothing was going on. Someone, or something, was down there, hidden behind a door I never opened. I could tell just from the look on her face, the way she went from all sweet to kind of nervous. My escape was a victory, but it came with a cost, a loss of innocence, a realization that trust can be a weapon. If you even get out at all, I carry that night with me, a scar that shapes every decision, every step I take in a world where smiles can hide the darkest truths. Thank you for listening till the end. Tomales, if you hear a knock at 3 a.m. tonight, don't answer it. Maybe the next story is coming. Symbiotes for you. See you the same in your next nightmare.